Hi everyone, I'm Shailendra Singh from Sequoia Capital, and I have with me the founder of Stripe, John Collison here. We are thrilled to be here, but most importantly, it's my privilege and honor to host John for a short interview. The history goes something like this. My partners in Sequoia US, Sir Michael Moritz, actually led an investment in Stripe some 6 years ago, a little over 6 years ago. And John, how old were you then?
I was 19, just turning 20 at the time.
Yeah, so I want to repeat that. John was 19, and isn't that incredible that we, Sequoia, was so fortunate to back John and Patrick at that young age. And now today, Stripe has just launched Southeast Asia here in Singapore. So John, tell us a little about your early years and what gave you the motivation to start Stripe when, the conventional wisdom was that payments is done and dusted, and PayPal was a little bit of a hidden entity within eBay. There wasn't really a big global payments company that you could point to. So what gave you the motivation and the courage?
Yeah, so rewind to 2009. On the one hand, you might think that this was a solved problem. There were already lots of big companies in this space. But if you actually talked to the people who were building the applications, who were building the websites, the opportunity started to become pretty clear. And I think that was an example of having been the target customer being a really useful place to actually go to start the company. If you were a developer back in 2009, one, you had to really convince one of the big banks to deign to work with you and spend months down a rabbit hole of paperwork. And then you spent all this time dithering, writing code that you really shouldn't have to deal with. And so Patrick and I looked at it and said, okay, this was miserable when we had to go through it. How can we make life really easy for the developer? What would we have wanted when we were in this position? We started from there. We got our first customer, we got our second customer, and we've basically been going from there.
That's amazing. And talk a little about maybe how Stripe has evolved. So that's what motivated you to start. But then Stripe seems to have evolved into this big platform company in the last 5-6 years. So maybe talk us through a little bit of that evolution in thinking and aspirations and vision, and also how Stripe is different now from the other payments companies that we sort of have all heard of.
Yeah, so that's what set the snowball rolling down the hill, this idea that, building the product that we wanted to exist. And I'll be honest, we did not have any highfalutin business plans or market plans, or we did not start out with the intent of knowing how big this could be. To give you guys a sense now, Stripe processes many billions of dollars across 25 countries for hundreds of thousands of businesses that are built across the platform. And the latest addition to that is, as of today, we're launched in Singapore, and we're working with all kinds of interesting Singaporean startups like Grab and TradeGecko and HipVan. The big difference with Stripe and the area where we kind of happily compete is the developers. Because when you think about it, those are the people who, and it's funny that this was contrarian back in 2009, but those are the people that you guys are funding that are actually building the apps and web services in question. And yet, nobody had paid that market any attention before Stripe. And so we not only provide the payments layer, but kind of a set of cloud services to make those developers' lives easy, so they spend less time working on the payment side of things and more time getting a good product to market.
Nice. And if you had a crystal ball and you could see where Stripe is headed, because the evolution of Stripe has been much talked about, and it's clearly really, really exemplary. And you and Patrick are still very, very young founders, and I'm sure you expect to do this for a long time to come. So where do you see Stripe in the near to midterm? Let's say if you had a 3 or 5 year view, how do you see Stripe's vision panning out? And then the next step of that will be how it pertains to Asia, to your international expansion. Maybe talk to us a little about that.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll give you guys the secret Stripe roadmap. The first area is developer tools and making life easy for businesses getting off the ground. And again, it's shocking to me that this was so unsolved before companies like Stripe came along. And so I'll give you one example of this, especially as we talk to countries within the Southeast Asian region, fraud is a huge issue. And again, you have teams being built up at companies just to manage and prevent fraud. Because Stripe has so much data flowing through it from all across the world, because we have in-house machine learning teams, we can actually provide some pretty nice tooling, and so that's something that we have and will continue to work on. And there's many other areas like that where you look at problems that all businesses are solving, we think we can provide tools to help them with that. That's one, developer services and cloud services. The second is international coverage, and basically our long-term goal is that you should be able to accept money from anyone, anywhere. And again, when you think about it, it's staggering that this is still so unsolved, in that the internet is not a new technology. We've been able to reach people from a communications point of view for a while, and yet you moving dollars, between Singapore and the US, between Singapore and Indonesia, those are still really hard problems. And so we are early on that trajectory, but we're already starting to go significantly beyond credit cards. We're doing bank transfers in the United States and Europe. In the US, we have a partnership with Alipay to let our Western businesses accept Alipay payments. And so we're going to go much further down that line of giving people a global platform for accepting money.
Yeah, that will be a real boon here. I can tell you our startups in Thailand pay 4+% in payment processing. And in many parts of Southeast Asia, people still use bank transfers as the primary means, and so a platform approach is needed.
Well, and oftentimes the links just don't exist, right? There are certain countries where if you want to accept money from there's kind of no good answer right now, or if there is an answer, it takes you many months to get it up and working, and that inhibits commerce. There's certain commerce that doesn't happen because the infrastructure isn't there.
Yeah, great stuff. And one question, there's so many payments companies that took the consumer route, like PayPal took the consumer route, and here in Southeast Asia, people are used to seeing these wallets emerge, Paytm, Freecharge in India, GoPay now in Southeast Asia. How have you guys resisted the urge to go down the consumer path and stay focused on your developers and as a platform company?
I think there's two things that probably guide us. One is, I think you want to have a pretty crisp sense of your mission and your long-term goals as a company. And for us, that is absolutely increasing the amount of commerce happening online by providing better tools for the businesses and the people actually accepting money. And so we would do a consumer offering if we thought it would help advance those goals. But as we look at the ecosystem, we're not tempted by it. And in particular, the consumer space is not short of people entering it, and you have all manner of companies from all manner of countries. We think there isn't going to be a single winner long term, and so what Stripe will be increasingly doing is helping people accept a variety of payment methods across a variety of countries. That's one. I also think you need to have a good sense for what you're good at as a company, and we think we're good at building developer tools, at building really nice APIs that make people's lives easier and help them build better applications. We could work on a consumer offering, but I think we would need a really crisp answer for why we think we would be better than anyone else's consumer offering, and that's something that we're just not at.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And tell us a little about, what things, there's lots of founders here at the conference, and several of them have aspirations to build a global business. You guys are embarked on this journey to expand. ASEAN and Southeast Asia looks like a stop for you. What are some lessons that you think that other companies that are a little bit further behind from you can draw? In a way, you're one of the rare companies that relatively early in your life has actually already charted this 25-country path, versus most Silicon Valley companies would do that much later, 10 years after they are founded and so on. So any experiences or any lessons from having done this early in your lives as a company?
Yeah, and this I think is particularly relevant to Singaporean startups, obviously. One thing we noticed in the data as we were beta testing Stripe was that the companies here are significantly more international focused, and they sell internationally at 2.5 times the rate of the Stripe average, which one would expect from the market dynamics. I think one, you are seeing this general trend of worlds colliding, and you don't get to choose to compete in a local region anymore. And no matter what the space you pick, you see this effect. And Stripe launching in Singapore both means that we support Singaporean startups, but by the way, we also support Western companies with their Singaporean market expansion. And so Kickstarter is expanding to Singapore, Deliveroo is expanding to Singapore. That obviously helps the Singaporean consumer, but it also means there are more people entering the contest. So I think that's one, is you kind of need to hold the standard you're competing against is the global standard, because even if you're not competing against a Western entrant or a Chinese entrant right now, you will be pretty soon, and that's what you should be planning for. The other thing about it for us is, we're a little different because the product is so nuanced. We have regulatory considerations and product considerations in each country. And so for us, it's a pretty long-term endeavor. Like, we've been working on international for 5 years now, and we're in 25 countries. We fully expect to be working on it for the next 5 or 10 years.
So your 4 or 5 year vision for Stripe is to be in 100 countries. Do you think this will keep going and you will be even more global as the time comes?
Absolutely. I mean, we want full global coverage for Stripe. We think that would be a very powerful thing that would actually drive the growth of the internet economy. I don't know if you guys saw Stripe Atlas, which we launched back in February, but basically the idea was there to help people who were in, especially further away countries, to help them incorporate US businesses if they wanted to do business in the US.
Terrific. One other question for you, and this comes from having lots of product discussions with our Indian startups who have come to Southeast Asia. How do you trade off the product priorities? Because you have an engineering team, you have product management function. Localization of international markets, initially they are small, and then I'm sure the teams locally are saying, hey, we'd love for you to localize these things for us to be more suitable to Indonesia, or to be more suitable to Thailand or Singapore. And then the guys back home in the US and the Bay Area are saying, hey, we have this crazy product roadmap anyway. So how does that work internally? How easy or hard is it for a Silicon Valley startup to sort of transcend the boundary and get committed to going international? Because that's the one big challenge that companies face, which is that they have the desire but not necessarily the will often to internationalize. So how are you making that happen?
Yeah, so, and by the way, every single startup I talk to that internationalizes faces this trade-off. And on the one hand, you have a seemingly infinite amount of work on improving the core product and new lines that you want to launch and expanding on that axis. On the second hand, if you look at Stripe as we internationalize, there are local considerations, and the product needs to be constantly tuned for the new markets we're entering, and there's a seemingly infinite amount of work in that axis. And so you have these two infinities stretching out into the distance. If there was an easy answer, I wouldn't be here, because I would be off. We'd have solved all the product things. I think one, you have to acknowledge that it's going to be a significant product undertaking if you want to win in these local markets, and have your kind of product planning and resourcing be ready for that. And then two, you will need to get better. It has forced us to get ruthlessly better at prioritizing, right, because you need to be very crisp, and the in-country teams will rightly be holding the product teams to account for what the product needs to do.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then as part of this roadmap, do you foresee a future where you might have local engineering teams here in Singapore or in other parts of the world?
Right, so right now Stripe is only in the United States. As we look long term, when companies get very large, companies like Google, they have very large numbers of engineering offices around the world. Microsoft has a very successful engineering office in China. And so as we look at the large technology companies that have done this successfully, they always seem to end up with local engineering. And so I think for us, it just becomes a question of timing. When is the right point to open that? Because the other thing we hear from these companies is that it is an undertaking, opening these offices.
Yes. No, that's great. And any last thoughts you have? I know time is quite short. We have a minute left here. Any last thoughts you have for people here, for startups? Any message? Lots of folks, I can tell you, in India, we have over a dozen companies in payments and fintech, and they all look up to Stripe. So is there any last one or two things, nuggets that you can share of the Stripe philosophy or the Stripe way that has allowed you guys to be so successful that people can take away?
I mean, the one thing I'd say is we designed Stripe to be this platform for digital entrepreneurship. You know, an interesting thing about Stripe is we don't try to get involved in the transaction or own your customer. We want to be in the background supporting the businesses that people build and kind of handling an increasing amount of the complexity for them. And I just think in 2016 in Southeast Asia, it is amazing. I mean, you must see it. It's amazing when you contrast versus just 5 or 10 years ago, the tools at your disposal to build an internet business with a really broad audience and a really broad impact. In that you have, obviously Stripe is a small part, but you have the Amazon Web Services and the Google Cloud platforms. You have a huge amount of open source software. The leverage that you can have as a small software team is phenomenal. I mean, Instagram, which you guys were an investor in, when they sold to Facebook, it was 8 people. You know, 8 people had built this enormously large and successful startup and created a huge amount of value. And that's what gets us excited. You know, for us, it's not about we're not chasing companies that were started a few years ago. We're looking forward over the next 5 or 10 years. What can we do for those businesses that'll be started in that time period? That's
phenomenal. That's very inspiring. Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for having us. And,
thank you guys.
I don't think we have any questions yet, so I think we'll wrap here. It's a real pleasure to have you. Thanks a ton.
Cheers.